Hi, and welcome back. I'm going to start with a single guitar part. And I'll filter out the low end with Pro Q3. This is a very normal thing to do with a guitar part, helping to clean up low-end rubbish that might interfere with the bass. And as Pro Q3 is in zero latency mode, I'm doing it with a normal minimum phase filter. That means there's some phase shift, which I can show you in Plugin Doctor. Most of the phase shift happens well below the cutoff frequency. But nevertheless, there's still quite a lot of shift at the cutoff frequency of 100 Hz and above. So let's switch that high-pass filter to only affect the left channel. And we now have phase differences between the channels. The large phase shifts below the cutoff don't matter so much, as this region is significantly attenuated by the filter. But the filter is only attenuating by 3 dB at 100 Hz, and hardly at all up at 200 Hz, while still adding significant amounts of phase shift around this region. Now, maybe you're concerned that the right channel isn't high-pass filtered to remove the sub-bass rubbish. So let's split the EQ band to create separate bands for the left and right channels, and switch one of them to a steeper slope. And again, we've created phase differences between the channels, which are quite significant just above the cutoff frequency, but tail off to nothing at the high end. Let's apply this to our guitar part, and I'll A/B between a single stereo high-pass filter for both channels, and different high-pass filters for left and right. Notice how much wider the part sounds with different filtering for each channel. But you might be wondering, what happens to this setup in mono? Let's try it. And nothing really drastic has happened. Certainly no dramatic phasey comb filtering artifacts like in part 2. All I hear is the low frequencies dropping back slightly in mono. Let's go back to a frequency response analysis in Plugin Doctor. I'll save these curves as a reference. Then let's switch Pro Q3's output pan ring to mid-side mode and turn the side channel down, which is exactly the same as doing a mono sum. Notice the resulting mono filter response is very similar to the separate left and right curves. It's just a high-pass filter with no nasty surprises. But the phase differences between channels result in a little more cancellation around the cutoff frequency. 100 Hz is only 3 dB down in the left and right channels, but more like 6 dB down in the middle, as if the high-pass filter has shifted a little higher for the mono sum. This might seem like a mono compatibility issue, and indeed it could be in some contexts. But if you've got a bass part with a lot of 100 Hz content, it could be a huge advantage. Now we've tuned the guitar high-pass filter slightly higher for the mono version of the mix. The guitar will be slightly thinner sounding in mono, but won't conflict with the bass part so much. But when you listen in stereo, that guitar part can gain a richer bottom end, which is spread out to the sides of the mix where it won't interfere with the bass. We can visualize the difference by looking at the guitar part on a spectrum analyzer set to show the mid and side channels superimposed. With the same filtering for both channels, the part is completely mono and shows up in green. When I change the filter for one side, I'm shifting some of the low frequency energy in the guitar part out of the middle of the mix, where it can interfere with the bass, and into the side channel instead, where it shows up as orange and adds a lovely sense of width and depth. I'm going to use a variation of this technique on the bass part. Let's pick out some of the harmonics in the mid-range and give them a healthy boost. Then let's have a healthy cut a little higher up. Now I'll select both those bands and split them to create separate bands for left and right, and invert the gains so we get a roughly opposite response for the left and right channels. The harmonics in that region will now have significant volume differences between left and right when they land directly on those boosts or cuts, or significant phase differences between left and right when they land in between them. Let's see what happens in mono. The cuts and boosts partially cancel out, leaving a slightly bumpy frequency response. But as I've kept the EQ up in the mid-range, the low end of the part stays nice and flat with no nasty surprises. If you listen in mono while you tweak those cuts and boosts around, you should be able to find a setting which helps the bass to fit around the guitar in the mid-range. And this will help to add a sense of space and depth to the bass part when you listen in stereo. These tricks can work really well with a single mono part. But there's another classic trick for creating artificial stereo width. Record the part twice and pan them hard left and right. When double tracking like this, it usually sounds best when you play as tight as possible and try your best to play the part exactly the same the second time. But no matter how tight you're playing or singing, there will inevitably be phase differences between the two performances. And that's what we're exploiting to create the sense of width. Now you might think that, although we're hard panning each part, we won't have the same mono compatibility issues that we looked at in part 1. Although each individual part will get quieter in mono, it will be added to the double tracked part on the other side, and the two parts will help to reinforce one another. Well, sometimes this works better than others. Quite often, I find the mono version seems quieter than the stereo version. The best solution I've found is mid-side EQ. I've routed both parts to a subgroup with Pro Q3 inserted. And I'm going to listen in mono once again, in context with the mix. And look for a couple of frequencies that help those parts to fit better in the mono mix. Often I find that poking the guitars up through the mix in two different places is enough to create the sense of a big, full-sounding guitar part. Now I'll select both those bands and set them to just the mid-channel, so they're only affecting the middle of the guitars. Of course, we don't hear any change because we're still listening in mono. So let's switch back to stereo again and listen to how this has affected the stereo mix. The guitars might sound fine, in which case you're good to go. But they might now seem too prominent in the regions we've boosted, in which case try cutting back those same regions in just the side channel. In effect, what we're doing is shifting some of the energy in those frequency bands away from the sides of the mix and back to the middle. And now I'm going to do the opposite for the bottom end. I'll cut this region back from the mid-channel so it doesn't conflict with the bass when we're listening in mono. And then, while listening in stereo, I can optionally put some of that energy back into the sides with a side channel boost. If I toggle bypass for the EQ, the guitars still seem big and wide when it's on. But if I do the same in mono, the guitars now have much more clarity and definition with the EQ enabled. Let's try a more extreme example. Here's a simple pad sound from Twin 2. And I'll switch the unison parameter at the bottom to 2 voices. Immediately the sound gets richer, as we've doubled the number of oscillators and detuned them according to the spread parameter. But it's also got wider, as the unison copies of the synth patch are panned hard left and right. This is controlled by the stereo parameter over to the right. The detuning between the unison copies means the oscillators are all drifting in and out of phase with each other, and the result is profound phase differences between the left and right channels. If we view this on a goniometer, we see a kind of chaotic circle shape. Let's turn the stereo knob down in Twin 2, and notice the circle becomes more of an oval shape, taller than it is wide. If I keep going down to 0 stereo width, we end up with a straight vertical line. The same thing happens if we leave the stereo parameter at 100% and mono the master instead. The pad sound drops to mono and also seems a little quieter as well. This is actually often a good thing, as there's less room for things like pad sounds in the mono version of the mix. But you may have noticed that the stereo knob can go higher than 100%. Notice what this does to the goniometer display, which now displays an oval shape wider than it is tall. What we've actually done is to reduce the level of the mid channel and increase the level of the side channel, creating an artificially wide stereo signal, in which the side channel is louder than the mid channel. Viewing this on our mid-side spectrum analyzer, we can see that the side channel is now much higher than the mid channel for all frequencies, and shows in a warning red colour. This pad sound is now going to get dramatically quieter in mono, like so. Again, this might be regarded as a mono compatibility issue in a context where the pad sound is critical to the song. But if it's just a bit of extra texturing to fill out the mix, this might be just the ticket. You can add enough of this pad to create a nice sense of width in stereo, but it will all but disappear in mono, and avoid cluttering or crowding the mono downmix. But let's look at a more sophisticated version of this approach. I'll set the stereo width back to 100% in Twin 2, and instead load an instance of ProQ3 to process its output. Now I can selectively widen or narrow different parts of the frequency spectrum. Let's have a healthy cut in the low mid-range, where this part is most likely to interfere with things like guitars. And I'll switch this cut to just the mid-channel to only process the mono sum. Optionally, you can also boost this same region in the sides as well. Now this region is very prominent in stereo, but when you drop to mono, it thins right out and gets much lower in level. Conversely, I could narrow the high frequencies by boosting them up in the mid-channel while cutting them back in the sides. Now those high frequencies won't really drop in level at all in mono, while the lower frequencies get dramatically quieter. What we've done, in effect, is to create a wide stereo pad sound with a rich mid-range, and we've encoded within that sound a very different mono pad that's all thin treble, leaving all the mid-range free for guitars or vocals. We can see this quite clearly on our mid-side spectrum analyzer. The side channel dominates in the lower frequencies, while the mid-channel is louder in the treble. This kind of mid-side EQ can be really useful when making sure your mono downmix doesn't suck. When you EQ the mid-channel, you're literally EQing the mono sum of both channels, allowing you to precisely tune what happens when your mix drops to mono. And when you EQ the sides, you're literally EQing the stuff that disappears in mono, allowing you to precisely tune what happens in stereo. Taking care of the mono downmix doesn't only help when you're listening in mono. I find it can also help to create a more focused and coherent stereo mix, with a nice solid center image, as well as a great sense of width and depth. Okay, that's all for now. Hopefully these tips will help you to create lovely, wide and spacious mixes with no hint of sucking in mono. Thanks for watching.